Hi, everyone. Welcome to another installment of the UCLA Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. I'm Clark Barrett. I'm the director of BEC, and I'm organizing the speaker series this year. If you'd like to find out more about our series, you can visit our website at bec.ucla.edu. There you'll find a list of upcoming talks, past presentations, including videos and links to our YouTube channel, which is UCLA Beck. You can also click the Get Involved tab on the website, and there you can enter your email address to join our listserv that will allow you to receive announcements for future talks, and you can also unsubscribe to the listserv there if you want to. Before I announce today's speaker, let me give you a preview of next week's talk. We're almost finished with our speaker series for the quarter, and then we'll be on spring break for a couple weeks. I think we have 2 more talks coming up. Oh no, just one more. And that is Sophie Scott from the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London. And Sophie's talk is called It's Funny, the Evolution and Science of Laughter. So please join me for that next week. Hopefully it will be true to the advertisement. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome Manvir Singh. Manvir is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, and his talk today will be called The Nature and Origins of Religious Super Attractors. If you'd like to unmute yourself for a moment, please join me in welcoming Manvir. And Manvir, go ahead and share your screen.
Thanks. Okay. Can everyone see my slide?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so like Clark just mentioned, the title of my talk is The Nature and Origins of Religious Super Attractors. I don't know if Clark knows, but he actually came up with the term super attractors several years ago on a phone call, which I'll talk more about why I find it useful or why I'm using it. But yeah, it was a conversation with Clark that seeded that word. I'm just gonna move.
I don't remember that, so
yeah,
I'm glad you do.
So all human societies seem to have some form of supernatural practice or belief, and there are particular domains of such practice and belief that seem to reliably emerge across societies. So societies everywhere have beliefs in spirits, they have practices of magic and divination, they very frequently have shamans and other magico-religious practitioners. They have beliefs in mystical harm, so that when something goes wrong, it's the work of other people using spells or other people having supernatural powers. And all of these practices, all of these cultural traditions are examples of what Pascal Boyer called in a publication 2 years ago or last year, wild traditions. And the term that I am going to use is religious super attractors. And so they're attractors because these are cultural domains that seem to reliably emerge in cultural evolution. In a Sperberian sense, they seem to be attractors in cultural evolution. And I'm referring to them as super because they are complex. So to take an example that we'll dig into later, shamanism is composed of trance, of dramatic initiations of a particular jurisdiction. It's a pretty complex cultural tradition, yet all of those components seem to reliably develop across human societies. So in his paper, Pascal lays out some characteristics of these traditions. They're ubiquitous, they exhibit deep commonalities. They predate what he calls doctrinal religions. So these are the institutionalized religions of large-scale societies. They include Abrahamic religions, Buddhism, etc. And they even seem to reappear when states and doctrinal religions try to destroy them. So given these features, it seems reasonable, and I think the prevailing conclusion, at least among evolutionary and cognitive researchers, is that these practices emerge because of psychological capacities shared among humans everywhere. So in this talk, I am going to think broadly about two questions. One, what is the form of religious super attractors? And two, why do they reliably appear? And I'm interested in this second question, not only because I want to and we want to understand religion, but also because it will help clarify the general processes shaping culture that are linking mind to cultural design. So I'm going to focus on three domains today: shamanism, religious self-denial, and moralistic spirits. I will not be addressing both of these questions for each of these domains, but for some of them I might ask both, for some of them I might only ask one. So let's first look at shamanism. So since 2014, I have been conducting fieldwork with the Mentawai people of Siberut Island. I'm going to talk much more about the Mentawai later in the talk, but for now, I just wanted to focus on how they organize humanity. So the Mentawai split all humans into two categories, Simata and Sikere. Simata essentially means uncooked or unripe. So it's usually used to refer to food, and it has this implication of being immature or not fully developed. Sikere, on the other hand, literally means one who has kered, where kere is a process. They have undergone this process and come out changed. And of course, there's this implication then of them being mature or developed in some kind of way. So the Sikere are the healers of Mentawai. They're special because they alone or nearly alone have the ability to see spirits. They see the spirits that cause illness. They can also see people's souls, or that's how it's often described. Entry into the Sikere is regulated, so they have these dramatic initiations that we'll look at a little later. They also have to find a teacher. They have to host a series of ceremonies. Sikere have many treatments, many interventions in which they heal, but the paradigmatic ones, the quintessential Sikere treatments, involve them going into trance. So they dance a beautiful dance, and in dancing, invite the spirits, invite good souls, and as those approach, the Sikere enter a trance state. And there are specific taboos that apply once you are a Sikere, and we'll also dig into that later. So this is a pretty, like I was mentioning, it's a pretty puzzling and intriguing package of practices and beliefs. But what's striking is that similar packages seem to emerge in pretty widely divergent contexts. So Evans Pritchard famously wrote about the Borongua, the witch doctors of the Azande, who live in what is now the DRC and South Sudan. The Borongua are the healers of the Azande. They also enter trance, although it's conceptualized differently than in Mentawai. In trance, they can see illness, so they can see signs of witchcraft. Entry is regulated, so on the right, you probably can't see this very well, but this is an initiate who's being, it's their funeral and they're being buried. Initiates also have to find teachers. They actually have to consume the magically imbued phlegm of an existing teacher, according to Evans Pritchard. And again, there are these specific taboos that apply. And so similar practices have been described elsewhere. So Elkin famously wrote about the Aboriginal men of high degree in Australia, as he called them. Similar practices have been described in South America. So this is a photo that Chagnon took. Similar practices have been described in Central and North Asia. And so following many anthropologists, I'm going to refer to this as shamanism. And I will define a shaman as a practitioner who uses trance to provide services, most frequently healing and divination. And in that trance, they often engage with an unseen reality. I'm going to define trance as a temporary state that appears biologically and psychologically distinct, foreign from normal human functioning. So there are some definitions that really focus on the neurobiological substrate of trance. I'm agnostic to what the neurobiology is here. It's really just from a behavioral perspective, from an observer's perspective, it is totally foreign from how a human should normally function. The manifestations of trance can be manifold. So an individual might violently shake, they might be incredibly still, they might act like a demon, and so on. The point is simply that it's foreign. So shamanism appears to be ubiquitous. So in 2016, Peoples et al. Had a paper in Human Nature. I think they found shamans and 26 of 33 hunter-gatherers, but I'm convinced they were missing a couple. Winkelman in 1986 coded a stratified, or he coded a subsample of the standard cross-cultural sample. So this is a pseudo-random sample covering human, cultural, and geographic diversity. He found trance practitioners in 43 of 47 societies. This includes medicine men, this definition of shamans. It includes medicine men, channelers, witch doctors, mediums, ecstatic priests, prophets, like the Quaker founder George Fox, or the Hebrew prophets. So here are some of the common features. We've talked about trance, we've talked about these traumatic initiations. They also shamanism frequently involves things like chanting, drumming, dancing, displays. They might walk on fire, they might stab themselves with knives, costly prohibitions. They might be peculiar, so they might be epileptic or intersex, or if you go onto the Wikipedia page for shamanism, the photograph, the main photograph is, I think, a Buryat shaman, and if you look at his thumb, it seems to be split. It almost looks like he has two thumbs that were fused into one, so they might have additional fingers. They might say there are crystals inside their body. They might say, you know, they may have been struck by lightning. They may have had a miraculous conception. And so all of this raises this very basic question of why shamanism? So there are a couple of approaches and frameworks that anthropologists have used that they've found useful. I'm not going to go too deeply into these. This is just a quick survey. One is to view shamans as people suffering from mental illness, and cultures kind of contextualize that or give meaning to it. This is a view that the shamans are schizophrenics, psychotics, epileptics. Another perspective really focuses on the charlatanism aspect of shamanism. So shamanism does involve some pretty deliberate sleight of hand, and we'll look at some of that later. Another approach is to see shamanism as a technology for inducing the placebo effect. Perhaps the most developed approach is the neurotheological theory, or the integrative theory by Winkelman. And Winkelman argues that trance is this cross-culturally consistent state that shares some neurobiological correlates, and in trance there are, as he writes, connections among what he says are modules that allow for greater insight, greater leadership. These individuals have more knowledge about natural history. It's essentially a view that shamanism is an effective technology of producing insight. So right now I am going to present what I call a subjective model of shamanism. I am calling it subjective because I will argue that shamanism develops not because of individual or group level benefits, but essentially because of its subjective psychological appeal. And so very coarsely, I'm going to argue that shamanism essentially adapts to or hacks our beliefs and our cognitive architecture to appear as this very plausible means of controlling uncertainty. And so I'll just break down that this model into three parts. So the first is simple. Humans seem to have a psychology of superstition. We seem to be predisposed to adopt relatively low cost, ineffective techniques to influence outcomes that are important, that are ultimately uncontrollable, yet which randomly resolve. There's a good deal of empirical and theoretical research on this, much of it showing that superstition can be explained as a kind of bet hedging psychology. So for people who are familiar, this is sometimes explained within an error management framework. So we need to select goal-directed behaviors. Payoffs are noisy. It's often hard to explicitly know whether an intervention causes an outcome and with which likelihood. So we instead rely on these erroneous heuristics that are on average useful, but produce and sustain ineffective low-cost behaviors to influence these ultimately very important outcomes. And the result of this is that humans overwhelmingly use magic and superstition for these events that are very important, uncontrollable, and which randomly resolve. So healing illness, inviting animals, changing the weather, changing crops, doing well on school exams, doing well on gambling, all things that humans really want to have control over, and which they benefit to some degree, and which randomly resolve. So the argument is then that there is a selection for intuitive magic. So essentially, as people are looking for the best ways of controlling these uncertain outcomes, they selectively retain, they drive this cultural evolution of highly psychologically compelling magic. So we can think that as specialists are competing in these markets to provide these magical services, magic evolves to become increasingly effective seeming. And a great anecdote that I think illustrates this logic is the story of Kisalid, a Kwakwaka'waka shaman described by Franz Boas. So Franz Boas got the autobiography of Kisalid. This is not a photograph of Kisalid, but I'll quickly just present the story. So Kisalid describes learning from his teacher that when you are healing illness, so let's say, I'm healing someone and their arm hurts, or that, they feel sick in their arm. When you're healing it, you suck on the place where there's illness, and beforehand you put some down in your mouth and you bite down and you get that down bloody. So you're sucking, and then you pull out this bloody down and you say, there it is, there is the illness. And so Casali describes going into this community, and in that community, the major sucking technique is you suck and then you just spit, there is the illness. And he comes in and he's pulling out this bloody manifestation of illness. And people are blown away. So he's getting all of these clients. Other shamans are coming to him. They're begging him to learn his technique. They're offering him. There's an example of, I think, someone offering their virgin daughter to have sex with Kasalid. But the larger idea is just that these markets for magic accelerate this process such that if there are some innovations that are highly cognitively appealing, they seem to be quite successful and have the capacity to spread. So the argument is that shamanism is the outcome of this cultural evolutionary process. And in particular, what the shaman is doing is they seem to be transforming into an entity distinct from normal humans, at least ostensibly, to claim special powers. And I'll dig more into this final point. So there's a lot of work in psychology, in anthropology, showing that humans seem predisposed to believe that invisible forces control these random uncontrollable events. So why did my mother get sick? Why did we get rain after weeks of a drought? Why did some prey animals serendipitously appear in hordes? It's God, fate, witches, ancestors, and so on. And so the way that the shaman really compellingly provides this control over uncertainty is that they claim to engage with these invisible forces that are overseeing these uncertain outcomes. Now, the engagement, again, can be manifold, or the manifestations can be manifold. They might leave their body and commune with them in an upper world. They might claim to see it. They might become possessed by these spirits. Whatever the point is that they're engaging with them. Now, of course, let's say Clark comes to me and he's like, yo, Manvir, I need to heal a family member's illness. And I'm like, no problem, Clark. Let me just go and talk to the God who oversees illness. He would, of course, be skeptical, like I'm a regular human. And so the important thing here is that people seem to attribute special abilities to individuals who diverge from humanness in some kind of way. There is some research in psychology and religious history. It's admittedly not like a topic that has received so much study, but I think an example that really clearly demonstrates this logic is the superhero story. So a superhero story centers on this individual having powers that normal humans do not. And the way that's made reasonable for the audience is that they have this origin story in which they diverge from normal humanity. So they might be bitten by a radioactive spider. They might have some wide-sweeping genetic mutation. They might be an alien from another planet. They might have a very high midichlorian count. Whatever it is, they somehow diverge from normal humans, making more credible or more reasonable these claims that they have powers that humans do not. And so the argument is that these constituent core features of shamanism, the dramatic initiation, the trance, are essentially performances of transformation or performances of strangeness to make more credible these claims of special powers. And in most circumstances, the precise way in which they transform will correspond with the powers that they're claiming. And I'll come back to that. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Okay, so I've proposed right now that dramatic initiation is this kind of performance of transformation, or this ostensible transformation to make more credible or more reasonable these claims of special powers. That contrasts with Winkelman's neurotheological framework, in which he says that these initiations are what he calls opportunities for psychological transformation. There is a disintegration, he says, of psychological structures that allows for this special insight. It contrasts with an explanation put forward by Achterberg about, in Achterberg's placebo account, in which Achterberg focuses on initiatory illness in particular. So many shamans in starting their careers will have a very severe illness. And Achterberg argues that initiatory illness builds antibodies that makes them a better healer. Yet when we look at initiations across societies, we see that they take an incredibly diverse forms, but what they very consistently share is this fundamental transformation. So the shaman might have a death and rebirth. They might undergo surgery, dismemberment, or magical treatment of body parts. So it might be said that they were taken into the desert and they were cut open and all of their bones and organs were replaced by new organs. There might be a transmission of magical substances. You know, we put magical crystals inside their body. They might undergo a really spontaneous biological and behavioral anomaly. So they might start to excessively bleed or have epileptic fits or suddenly seem to be crazy. They might have frenzies. So if you recall in Mentawai, I mentioned that the special trait is that the shamans have eyes that can see spirits and souls. And much of the initiation really centers on the transformation of the initiate's eyes. So this is a picture I took a couple years ago during an initiation. And you can't tell, but there are people watching all around as this existing shaman applies magical herbs and leaves to the initiate's eyes. And so actually after this occurs, the initiate goes with some other shamans and dances and calls their fathers and their father's fathers, and seeing their ancestors, they cry. And it's a very public demonstration that now they have this new physical trait and with it these new abilities. So I've also said that trance is this drama of strangeness to make more credible these claims of supernatural powers. This contrasts with this view that's quite prominent in the literature on shamanism, that trance is this cross-culturally consistent state, that it's beneficial to the group, to the client, to the practitioner. I'm not going to go into this right now, but there has been quite a bit of work showing that different techniques, different induction techniques produce profoundly different psychological states when used to induce altered states of consciousness. And this might be obvious to some people here, but a state induced by hallucinogens is very different from one induced by a night of dancing, from heavy breathing, from social isolation, from fasting, from repeated drumming. And it's actually unclear what, if any, consistency there is to that. And I'd be glad to talk about that later. Right now, though, I just wanted to emphasize that when we in fact look at trance, it's not only that it is behaviorally and psychologically very foreign from normal human functioning, but it very often includes these displays of superhuman abilities. So there might be immunity to fire. Again, they might stab themselves, they might walk on swords, they might possess inaccessible knowledge, so speak the languages that only these spirits know. They may engage in physically impossible tasks. So one of these ethnographies might have been the Chukchi. I remember talking about, like, in trance, the shaman removes their nose for the audience. Yeah. So just to sum up this first part of the talk, I've argued that shamanism is this set of practices adapted to our psychology to convince observers, to convince clients that can influence these uncertain outcomes. And the larger implication is that cultural patterns may occur, they may recur because of their subjective appeal. Cultural evolution seems capable of crafting traditions to conform to our cognitive architecture. And so the process that I've just described, that I've just laid out, I think as an example of a broader set of processes that, that I have been calling subjective cultural selection. And I think this is actually how many people think about cultural evolution working. I think this is most people's folk model of how cultural evolution works, something along these lines, yet it seems to have been surprisingly underdeveloped in the cultural evolutionary literature. But as humans have goals, our goals are psychologically determined. We seem to selectively retain variants that we evaluate as satisfying those goals. So, you know, I want to kill animals, I try out spears, I confront and encounter different variants for using those spears. Some variants seem to work better. Over time, as I selectively retain those variants that I subjectively evaluate as being effective, I drive the cultural evolution of something like a spear, something like effective technology. But if my goals are different, you know, if I want to experience pleasure or be entertained, or if I just have various psychological biases or constraints that constrain my ability to accurately evaluate how useful a technology truly is for satisfying those goals, I can produce these other technological outcomes. I think there's an impulse to draw this distinction between adaptations and byproducts, but I think we can actually think about a lot of culture as simply a technology that has evolved because it really appears to best achieve a regular goal. And so that's just a takeaway that I wanted to put forward from that first part of the talk. So now I'm going to talk about self-denial. Many religions of complex societies impose costly prohibitions on clerics. These can include prohibitions on sex, such as among Aztec clerics and Buddhist monks and nuns. They might include prohibitions on desirable food items, like with Trappist monks or Hindu Brahmins. But in fact, these prohibitions also apply to magical religious practitioners across societies. So in Winkelman and White's database, they found that in 47% of the societies they looked at, shamans were prohibited from sex during initiation or ceremonies. In 53%, they were prohibited from food. In 72%, they had to suffer or engage in some kind of social isolation. And this is only on the basis of coding ethnography, so I think it's reasonable to think that these are underestimates. And of course, this is puzzling. So these practitioners are considered supernaturally powerful. We would expect them to manipulate these rules for self-serving purposes. And so it raises this basic important question of why do religious rules appear to harm them the most? Okay, so there are 3 hypotheses that I am going to review that people have put forward to explain various forms of costly religious behavior. All of the ones that I'm going to review here hypothesize that by engaging in religious self-denial, practitioners are affecting observers' beliefs about them. So essentially, all of these hypotheses either say that religious self-denial is a signal of some underlying trait, or at least observers are treating the behavior as informative. And as a result, all of them will make predictions about the inferences observers should make from a shaman's self-denial. And this will become very clear what I mean if it's not clear at the moment. So the first is cooperative costly signaling. The idea here is that by engaging in this costly self-denial, these practitioners are somehow signaling a cooperative disposition. Maybe it's commitment to the group, an intention to stay for a long time. And the prediction over there would be that observers infer cooperativeness from the self-denial. Another hypothesis is this one put forward by Joe Henrich, that these behaviors are what he calls credibility enhancing displays. And his argument is essentially that these kinds of costly behaviors lead others to infer sincere belief. So if I'm engaging in this very costly behavior, I wouldn't do so if I didn't actually believe in the supernatural enforcement, for instance, that is supporting it. The final hypothesis just builds on the logic of the first part of the talk. I'm going to call it supernatural otherness. And so the idea here is that by engaging in this self-denial, shamans somehow promote this perception of them being fundamentally different in some way. So by not having sex, by not eating food, they seem to diverge from normal humans in some way. And that makes more credible the argument, or the hypothesis goes, that they have these supernatural powers. So I tested among these hypotheses as a part of my fieldwork in Siberut with the Mentawai. So this is Siberut Island. It's off the west coast of Sumatra. It's in the Mentawai archipelago. I mostly have worked in a village called Butui right here. It's next to this other village, Ugai. But I've done comparative work in these 4 regions. And A lot of the work that I'll describe later will focus on comparisons among these 4 regions. One of the reasons I decided to conduct long-term fieldwork in Mentawai is that it has all of these rivers, as you can see. So it's covered with these rivers. And this means people only live on the river, and it has led to an interesting cultural diversification. So people speak slightly different dialects. They have slightly different, for instance, taboo systems, slightly different tattoos. It's an interesting laboratory of cultural evolution. You can see which features of their cultural systems have remained stable and which are more liable to vary. So the Mentawai are sago and fruit horticulturalists, the rainforest horticulturalists. They're Austronesian, so they seem to have been relatively early in the Austronesian expansion, although they lost metal and rice on getting to the island. They raise pigs, chickens, they forage for a diversity of foods. They're increasingly integrated into the market. They traditionally lived in these longhouses called uma, and they would also have like small houses that are satellites. Now they live in a combination of government settlement villages and longhouses. So it's very often that like shamans will continue to live in these longhouses where families that have young children will really benefit from living in these government settlement villages because they have schools, they have health clinics. This is a picture of an uma. You can see these women are hanging out. There are the skulls of foraged animals on the back. They look out. There's a mosquito net. It's a big space. Here's like, this is the outside. This is a picture of a government settlement village or a government settlement house. This is the photograph that pops up when you Google Mentawai people. This is maybe a more accurate image of what life, just a snapshot, would look like. So you see that there are these banana trees. Behind them, there's all this sago. These are these government settlement houses. Here's the clinic. All of these people are watching as a bulldozer comes in and is making way for a road. So my fieldwork involves a diverse methodological toolkit involving participant observation, systematic interviews, various field experiments. In many of the photos, you'll see these men who are tattooed and do not wear pants. They wear a loincloth. So these are almost always shamans. They're almost always sikere. This guy was not a sikere at the time of the photograph, so he was one of those guys who like wanted to be a sikere. But since then, he has actually become a sikere. This is the field site. It's this house. It's on this river, the river Butui. Here are some people hanging out. Okay, so these were the 3 hypotheses that, if you recall, I wanted to test among. And so this project involves 3 parts. The first is just ethnographic. What are the taboos on shamans in Mentawai? So during initiation, during ceremonial periods, and then what are the permanent dietary taboos? The second is just to understand, are those taboos costly? If so, how costly? This is more, again, to just understand the ethnographic context. And then finally, the question that's most relevant for testing among our hypotheses, what do people infer from costly self-denial? And so I'll just go through these 3 questions. So as a part of a larger project that was about characterizing variation in various beliefs in southern Siberut, I conducted 87 interviews across these 4 regions. And I asked about initiation taboos, taboos during ceremonial periods, and then these permanent dietary taboos. For now, just for the sake of time, I'm only going to talk about the permanent dietary taboo stuff, but I'm glad to talk about the other stuff later. So essentially, I presented each participant with a checklist of 15 items that during pilot studies were shown. I think at least two or three individuals during pilot interviews across various regions in southern Siberut listed these to be taboo to shamans. And then I also included the Mentawai langur, which is near unanimously, if not unanimously, said to be not taboo to shamans. So that's just to make sure people like comprehend and are telling the truth. Just to interpret what's going on here. So a white cell means that no one in that region said that the item was taboo to shamans. A dark blue means that everyone in that region, and the rows correspond with the different regions. So you can see only one person mentioned the Mentawai language, and they actually had all kinds of nuances. So it did seem that people understood and they were telling the truth. I then used Bayesian cultural consensus analysis to identify which items were tabooed, or determine the consensus of whether an item is tabooed in a given region. I found that there are 5 items that were said to be tabooed throughout southern Siberut. And actually, if you just look at the figure and you just look like, where is it all blue down, that is, you find the same thing. It's just a sanity check, but it's good to know that a very simple way of figuring this out is corroborated. And so you'll see throughout southern Siberut, shamans are tabooed from eating eels, flounders, gibbons, the white morph of the Simakobu monkey, not the black morph, and the 3-striped squirrel. So I also found that shamans seem to be tabooed from sex and food during initiation periods and during healing periods. So the second question is, are taboos costly? If so, how costly? So taboos on sex and various food items during initiation and healing seem to be pretty clearly costly, but I was then focusing on these 5 items. And so I'm not going to go too deeply into the methods, but I'm glad to talk about them later. What I essentially had participants do is I presented them with many, many items that Mentawai people, many foraged items that they eat, presented them with photos, pardon me, had them rank them by how willing they were to give them up. That was our proxy for cost, because it integrates both preference and availability. And so what I found is that these permanent dietary taboos seem to carry costs, but those, whether or not an item is costly or how costly it is to give up, actually seems orthogonal. And I think that's best demonstrated in just comparing eels and flounders. So the taboo on eels is an appreciable cost of all the river foods. It's the item that people are second least willing to give up, and it makes sense. Eels are big packages of protein. If you do a round of poisoning, you can get a couple eels. They're big. It's all good meat. They're great sources of protein. Flounders, on the other hand, these people, many of these communities just live in the interior. They only live on rivers. They've never seen a flounder. They've never eaten a flounder. In their rankings, flounders would often just be last. So like the taboo on eels seems to be costly. The taboo on flounders seems to not be costly at all. And finally, and we can talk about what's going on over there with these various items in the Q&A if people are interested. But finally, is this question relevant for our 3 hypotheses of what do people infer from shaman self-denial? So to get at this, I presented participants with 2 characters. The characters had all kinds of background information, owns this many canoes, has this many children. Background information was counterbalanced, the photos were counterbalanced, and what was systematically varied was that one individual self-denied and the other did not, and the self-denying individual either denied themselves particular food items or sex. And then I asked 14 questions targeting inferences about belief, cooperativeness, difference, power, these traits that are relevant for our hypotheses. So then I use a mixed effects logistic regression to ask, what is the likelihood that a participant chooses the self-denying shaman given they are asked about belief, cooperativeness, etc.? So a score of 1 on this plot means that participants inferred self-denying shamans to always exhibit that trait. 0 means that they thought that self-denying shamans never exhibited that trait. And what I found was, in fact, quite significant or appreciable effects for all of them. So people seem to infer that they're sincere believers, that they're more cooperative, that they are more different from normal humans, that they're more supernaturally powerful. These are 95% confidence intervals. I did not find an effect of the category of self-denial, so food versus sex, although if you'll see that it was trending towards sex. Actually, they seem to be making stronger inferences about sex, but on the basis of a p-value that would be provisionally rejected. I've also just very quickly run pilot studies with Turkers in the US and India. These are just preliminary But in the US, we find that people infer power, difference, and belief, but not cooperativeness from practitioners who deny themselves food and sex. In India, we find that they infer power, cooperativeness, and belief, but they actually regard themselves as more similar. In their comments, they often describe it in the context of being pure. So again, this is preliminary. These are just things we want to dig into more. But yeah, so I found that observers infer cooperativeness, belief, difference, and supernatural power. So I essentially found support for all of these. I think if there's one major takeaway, it's that the literature has really focused on religious behavior as a cooperative costly signal. To some extent, people are now also really thinking about belief. But if there's one takeaway, it's that people's inferences about self-denial are multidimensional. Maybe several mechanisms are going on. Maybe some of these are epiphenomenal, but it's at least a call to look beyond cooperativeness. And more generally, it's support for these functioning to build credibility. Not just like sincere belief, but general credibility as a supernatural practitioner. So just to come back to these first two projects and this question of why shamanism. So in the first part, I argued that these markets for intuitive magic produce these practitioners and these practices that exploit our intuitions to seem effective. And they do so, these shamans do so by apparently transforming to make more credible these claims of having supernatural powers and communing with unseen agents. And then in the second part, I found support for the hypothesis that these costly prohibitions are promoting perceptions of credibility and efficacy. Also, I can't see the questions, so I don't think it doesn't sound like anyone has had a question, but you can always feel free to jump in. But I guess there's also like half an hour of Q&A, but I don't mind if anyone has questions. Okay, so this last part, the third section of the talk, is on moralistic gods. So for many people, these are the images that come to mind when we think of religion: hell, a big moral god. In other words, these images of moralistic supernatural punishment. And anthropologists have long been interested in just how widespread such moralistic punishment is. And a common view, going back to Tyler, is that it's restricted to modern large-scale societies. So this is the first sentence from Whitehouse et al.'s 2019 paper in Nature. They say, rarely are supernatural agents in global history believed to punish moral violations and interactions between humans. Yeah, they might care about sacrifices or taboos, but rarely do they care about moral behavior. And this is the first sentence of Pascal Boyer and Nicolas Balmat's paper in Trends in Cognitive Science in 2013. First sentence of the abstract: moralizing religions, unlike religions with morally indifferent gods, appeared only recently in some, but not all, large-scale societies, human societies. And so for believers in world religions, when we're thinking about the moral jurisdiction, we're often thinking about something like this. So we can see that for Christians, for karma believers, for Hindus and Buddhists, supernatural agents are believed to care about quite a range of moral behavior. So many, many moral domains they care. The important thing is not the salience. I don't want to distract you with the salience. The important thing is that for these world religions, people are thinking about these supernatural agents as caring about greed, harm, unkindness, generic immorality, cheating, intolerance, and so on. So it's in the context of that debate, of that literature, that I learned about Sikamainen. So I learned about Sikamainen both in my first field visit, my first summer in Mentawai, and then Sikamainen was also described in the writings of a Swiss anthropologist who spent quite a bit of time in the Mentawai, Reimar Sheffold. And Reimar Sheffold actually studied and worked with a community very closely affiliated to the communities that I worked with. They actually live in a different part of the island, but they moved there recently. Yeah, so what Sikamainen is, at least in this community, it was said that there's a belief in this water spirit who attacks individuals who do not share. And then these shamans, the Sikere, are called to remove this water spirit from these stingy people's houses in a particular healing ceremony. So I wanted to ask 3 questions over here. The first is, very simply, is Sikamainen believed to enforce cooperation? And if so, how does it compare with these big gods, with these supernatural forces in these world religions we just looked at? 2 is a much simpler question, but it's, do people believe in Sikamainen? And so this is actually quite an important and big question in the cognitive and evolutionary study of religion. But there's this question of whether supernatural belief actually changes people's understandings of the payoffs of behavior. Do people make decisions they otherwise would not have made because of beliefs in supernatural agents? And finally, this is another question that has long been written about in anthropology, but does ritual reinforce belief in Sikamainen? So people have argued that ritual is this mechanism for transmitting belief, but there's been little kind of targeted empirical work aside from research with children. So I drew on 2 sets of data to answer these questions. The first are interviews about Sikamainen. So again, I'm part of this project of characterizing beliefs throughout southern Siberia. I interviewed 96 participants, and I asked each of them 7 questions. How many Sikamainen are there? What sex is it? Where does it live? Why does it attack? This is the relevant one for thinking about its moral jurisdiction. How does it attack? What happens when it attacks? Which objects are used in rituals to appease it? And the goal was both to get at the questions I just laid out, but also to provide like a rich characterization of this spirit, because it's quite cool. And there actually aren't so many like in-depth studies of what these supernatural agents look like in contexts like Mentawai. Okay. And then I also had healing ceremony data. So I collected data on 77 healing ceremonies, 66 of which passed a set of quality criteria. These were mostly in the villages of Butui and Ugai. I either attended a healing ceremony or I interviewed the patients or their family retrospectively. I collected data about many things, but this is just a quick list: treatments, which animals were sacrificed, how many days did it go on for, which individuals were called, did it work, what was the nature of the illness, and so on. Okay, that slide sometimes takes like a moment to load, I think, because this is a big image. But so I found that across these 4 regions, people describe this spirit, Sikamainen, associated with water, crocodiles, and sometimes long hair. So it's also known by the word Sikaoinen, which also means crocodile. And Sikoinen also means that which is in the water. So it's really often this mixture of water, crocodiles. It's believed to cause illness. It's appeased in shamanic healing ceremonies. So just to kind of appreciate the different manifestations, the different combinations of water, crocodiles, and individuals with long hair, this person drew Sikamainen as having the body of a crocodile, but its soul has the head of a person with long hair and the body of a crocodile. Here is someone who's drawn Sikamainen as a crocodile, but it has long hair. Some people would describe it as an individual with long hair, but then it uses a crocodile as, they would say, as its canoe, or it orders around crocodiles. It would say that it and the crocodile are friends. It was also very often associated with like essentially a big piece of fabric. So another name is Sibeo Depe, which means like kind of like that which has big fabric. Yeah. So I found that Sikamainen has these moral concerns, but it's really limited in its domain and its moral scope. So these are people's responses to the question of what does Sikamainen care about. You can see that near unanimously, people are saying that it cares if you do not share. And then when they explain what it does not, what it attacks you for not sharing, they almost exclusively or very frequently say that it attacks you for not sharing meat. Or they might specifically say pig or smoked meat or chicken. So it has moral concerns, but it's really limited in its domain. It's sharing meat, and meat sharing is something you only do with clan members and regular cooperative partners. So it's not caring about genetic or generic amorality, harming strangers. It's really caring, are you sharing meat with your fellow clan members? This is just a quick description of the ceremony. So the Sikere apologize to Sikameinen. They assure Sikameinen that the patient had meant to share but could not. So they might say the clan members were very far, they wanted to share, but it wasn't worth it, or they didn't think it was necessary. And I think that's critical or interesting just for the fact that it demonstrates, and I'll go through later some other pieces of evidence that demonstrate this, that Sikameinen cannot read minds. It can only read individuals on the basis of behavior. And it's also believed to be a crocodile very often. So it like slithers into your house. It can change shapes, but it's very much like an agent that is believed to cohabitate. So Sikameinen is attracted with fabric, in this case, a necklace, shamanic headdresses, kind of a dance skirt. Sikameinen, they then use songs to attract Sikameinen into this bowl of water. So this is what I meant when I said it changes shape. So it's like obviously small enough to fit in this small bowl of water, but people will also say it can weigh down on top of you. And then they'll really carefully deliver that into the river. And when the shamans are walking back, they're really careful not to spill that water because you don't want Sikameinen to get away. They're also really careful only to sing the Sikameinen song during one of these healing ceremonies. The idea being that if you just sing it, even while teaching an initiate how to be a shaman, if you sing it in those contexts, you will invite Sikameinen, and Sikameinen might attack and cause illness. So I think there are several indications that these healing ceremonies are costly. This is every healing ceremony that that only involved the Sikameinen intervention. So healing ceremonies can involve many interventions, but these are all of the ones in the data set that only involved Sikameinen. Just for reference, 15,000 Indonesian rupiah is about $1. But you should also know that in a neighboring village, a highly appealing government job pays about 800,000 or 900,000 a month. And this ceremony, for instance, cost more than $1 million Indonesian rupiah. So some of these healing ceremonies can be pretty costly. There are also opportunity costs. So I found that in my sample, 63 of illness bouts were also treated with magical or herbal remedies. 50% people sought out care at a village health post or a community clinic. A number of people, I don't have systematic data on this, but a number of people mentioned trying alternative healers, so Christian syncretic healers, or like a Muslim teacher, an ustad. And so by spending all of these resources and spending all of this time inviting these shamans to remove Sikameinen from your house, you are losing the opportunity to seek out these other interventions. The Sikameinen ceremony also seems to be quite common. So like I mentioned, the Sikere have all of these special interventions that they do that target different ideologies. And Meinen is the most common one. Other than the ones that you do in every ceremony, Meinen, which is for Sikameinen, is the most common. And so I counted, and I'm guessing that I missed a bunch, but I counted 19 in a community of about 260, 19 ceremonies in a year in a community of about 260 individuals. Just back of the envelope math, if each ceremony has 70 attendees, that's like a 4/5 chance of attending in a given year. So maybe by the time you're 5, you've gone to a couple. You're also constantly hearing about this as you're walking by, especially in the government settlement villages. As you're walking by a house, you can hear that someone's doing this. Yeah, it's also, if you're walking home with meat, because I saw that, or I mentioned that they kill animals, they sacrifice animals, and they actually share them. The shamans get the best portions, but if you're walking home with meat, then everyone knows that they frequently know that you're coming from a healing ceremony. You might also be coming from another event, but that's, I think, probably the most common context. So then there's this question of, do healing ceremonies reinforce belief? So first, I just found that people who pay for a Sikameinen ceremony later attributed illness to it. Only 11% of people who held a Sikameinen ceremony later said that their illness was caused by Sikameinen. So it would suggest that the ceremony is to some extent reinforcing the belief that it causes illness. I think this is an underreport, because to say that Sikameinen caused your illness is to say that you were not sharing. Also, people very often explained features of Sikameinen by pointing to the ceremonies, just in the interviews. So they might say, Sikameinen is female because Sikere call it Meinen. Meinen, Kameinen means aunt. So the polite name for this spirit is aunt, like auntie. They might say it lives in the water because that's where the Sikere put it. They might say it watches from above in the house because that's where Sikere are looking when they are singing to it. Finally, and I'm not going into this data over here, but I'm glad to present this. I think there's actually some complexities to this, but we found that agreement seems to be highest so for participants' responses, and we calculated agreement with a technique, but we found that agreement seems to be highest for those features that are represented in the healing ceremonies, whereas those features not represented in the ceremonies have very low agreement. So just to give you a quick intuitive sense, this is why does it attack? This is where does it live? And you can see that there's much more agreement for these questions than for a question like what happens when it attacks? So what symptoms does it cause? Or how does Sikaoinen specifically attack? So what does it do to humans? So just to quickly review these questions, is Sikameinen believed to enforce cooperation? If so, how does it compare with big gods? We found that it does care about cooperation, but its powers and its jurisdiction are pretty limited. Do people believe in Sikameinen? Well, people are paying costs for Sikere to come and remove Sikameinen, and that includes opportunity costs. Does ritual reinforce belief in Sikameinen? It seems so. There's this high agreement on those elements that are represented in the ceremony. So we should, of course, be careful in the conclusions we draw from a single case study. Oh, wait, can you see the screen that has my notes?
No.
Okay, okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Well, I can anyway.
Okay, so we should, of course, be careful in the conclusions we draw from a single case study. But I think one fair conclusion over here is that moralistic punishment may be more common than we suspect. And there have been surveys of ethnography. So Chris Bohm in 2008 surveyed a bunch of hunter-gatherer ethnography. Joseph Watts's 2015 paper in Proc B also just involves coding ethnography. And I think these more general codings of ethnography support the kinds of conclusions we have in this much more detailed study. Of course, a very reasonable question is to what extent do Islam and Christianity contribute? I think there is a good evidence to conclude that Islam missionary activity did not affect Sikameinen, at least missionary activity starting in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century. And we can talk more about what leads me to conclude that. Nevertheless, there are indications that, for instance, the Mentawai have been trading with Sumatrans for cooking pots and whatnot long before Europeans arrived. So I can't reject the idea of there being interactions over there. But there are interesting phylogenetic things. So the people of Nias is, the people of Nias are the most closely related to the people of Mentawai, to the Mentawai, both linguistically and genetically. And the people of Nias also describe beliefs in a putative crocodile spirit, although Nias is very hierarchical and the crocodile is linked to authority. So chiefs use crocodiles to attack prisoners and to enforce laws. Okay, so I focused, just to wrap up, I focused on these domains: shamanism, self-denial, moralistic spirits. But these projects are part of a larger question that drives my research program, which is why do human societies reliably develop entire suites of strikingly similar cultural practices? So just an example of some of these other projects, I had a paper that just came out this weekend, everyone should download it, on witchcraft and sorcery, in which I identified cross-cultural patterns and beliefs about witches, sorcerers, evil eye, shapeshifters, using the probability sample file of the human relations area files. And then using those patterns, argued that these seem to culturally evolve to be plausible explanations of misfortune, especially when people are predisposed to attribute misfortune to malice. So maybe circumstances under which adaptive paranoia would be triggered. Those seem to be shaped by existing beliefs in magic, and they are very often leveraged and subsequently transformed for the purpose of demonization, in which they actually, the witchcraft beliefs that we find in these societies, so these really witchy, demony ones, resemble narratives about heretics, dissidents, the Tutsis, the Mau Mau rebels, the communists in Indonesia in 1965. Yeah. Also with Sam Mayer and Luke Lowacki, I have co-directed The Natural History of Song. I think Sam was actually in, he spoke a couple weeks ago, so I won't go into that. Right now, with many colleagues, I'm building a database of story that we want to use to identify what's universal about narrative, what varies. And the larger takeaway of all of this work, I think, is for the potential process or importance of a process like this, that many cultural practices seem to evolve as humans selectively retain those variants that they evaluate as satisfying their many goals. And that can produce institutions, it can produce effective technology, it can produce what we might otherwise think of as byproducts. And I'm, of course, down to dig into that more. So just to reach out to my funders, and I was affiliated with Harvard, but they also funded me. Right now I'm at IST. Joe and Ted were my co-authors on some of these papers, Joe Henrich and Ted Kapchuk. Luke is not an author on any of these papers, but Luke is, like, always deserves a shout out for my work because he's a great mentor. These are my two main field assistants, Aman Asaiba, Rustam, and Aman Jamanu. So a shout out to them. And with that, I will take questions if there are any.
Great, thank you, Manvir. That's a fantastic talk. We have time for questions. I also thought I would mention, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but today at UCLA, in UCLA, the anthropology department we're welcoming the admitted graduate students who have been admitted for the incoming year, and some of them are here with us today. So I'd like to welcome them as well and invite them if of course, if they'd like to ask questions, please do. So our tradition, our Zoom tradition, is to use the raise hand function, and I will be monitoring for that. Manvir, maybe you might want to unshare your screen just so we can see more faces, and if you do need to share it again for some data or something, we can do that later. So I'll keep a list and I'll call on you in order. Let's take a question from Alan Fisk.
Hi, Manvir. That was really, really interesting, and I applaud your combination of field work and quantitative analyses, both sampling at your field site and across cultures. Really, really interesting, and it's something I've been interested in for a long time and very curious about. So I found your talk very enlightening. Let me ask about the construct of shaman. So you mentioned a number of features that define shamanism, but we all know that sometimes one of those features occurs without the others. So, you know, in Bali, there are spirit mediums who are very important in communicating with the spirits, but they, as far as I know, they don't have initiation rites, or they don't have taboos or abstain from food or sex, and they don't do painful things and so forth and so on. Where I worked in West Africa, there are lots of people who are diviners. They divine by tossing cowrie shells or other means what the spirits and gods are up to, and whether your suffering is due to witchcraft or sorcery or violation of a taboo, but they don't meet any of your other criteria. So the question is, what have you done to validate the construct of shamanism, which you use in a much broader way than the narrower definition of shamanism as something that primarily occurs in Northern Asia? I mean, to what extent do those defining features actually correlate and discriminate shamanism from all the other things that have one of those features or two and not the others?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say that the definition I'm using was, and I admit it's a very broad definition, especially compared to authors who might restrict to, for instance, like you mentioned, North Asia. The definition I was using is practitioners who enter an ostensibly foreign state to provide services. So the features like initiations, taboos, etc. I do not want to make the claim that those are cross-culturally, that those define shamans. Your question is a fair one. Like the conviction that shamanism, the main claim that I've made in the paper and in the talk is that it very often involves some kind of initiation and trance, and that those very often correlate. In making that claim, I'm mostly going off of the anthropological literature and or like the folk wisdom of the anthropological literature. And I think it would be valuable, and it's probably pretty critical to maybe just code a lot of these practitioners from ethnographies and actually look at what correlates. But I will say that the larger approach, so I was very often using the word shaman and talking about these various features, but what I see more generally is that that was kind of a framework about specialists who provide services to deal with uncertain outcomes, and it more generally being about the processes that sustain that, the psychology of superstition, a cultural evolutionary process or a market that accelerates and creates these individuals that are kind of conforming to people's folk models. So I would see, for instance, in a very explicit analogy with something like a money manager, where they arguably do not have an effect on an outcome. People have a model that these outcomes are determined by invisible causal forces, and the most compelling or most effective seeming money managers, there's a competition among them, and they kind of construct these practitioners or these specialists who essentially their techniques conform to the people's folk models of what's going on. I only mention that to say that, yeah, I talk about things like initiation, like trance, but it's also a more general claim about the development of specialists who are dealing with uncertain outcomes. Does that answer your question?
Okay, sounds good. Let's take a question from Dan Hessler.
Thanks, Manvir. Really, really interesting. I want to, I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment or both, but I want to think for a minute about the notion of a super attractor, and then dive down into its constituents maybe. So you can define a super attractor two ways. One is the population level, which is how you opened up. So you basically said, look, there are these features that are really common, perhaps, near universal. So it must be the case that there's something happening that makes those features cohere. But another way of defining it with a parallel to the subjective psychology, which is where a lot of your talk focused, rather than the population level phenomenon, is by way of analogy to a super releaser in terms of the power of the stimulus. And there, I think you're on the right track, but I think you can go further than you have done, in that it seems to me that one of the things that makes for a really effective constellation of ideas in terms of its success in the marketplace of ideas is that it doesn't just resonate with one intuition. That is, there isn't just one psychological Sproverian attractor. There are multiple, and those things overlap so that they reinforce each other. So if we look, for example, at the taboos that you presented, right? It wasn't just the case that there are patterns across believers in different geographical locations on the island. It was also the case that the foods which are tabooed are very patterned, namely that animal products are much more likely to be tabooed than plant products. And in fact, that is a universal pattern. It isn't, it's not that there are no exceptions, but it is vastly more likely that food products around the world that are tabooed will be animal products than vegetable products, right? So there's something else about meat, right, that makes it really, really salient in the notion of what constitutes a meaningful taboo. And that intersects, and here I want to think a little bit about difference in supernatural power, right? that intersects in a way that I don't think any difference constitutes an attractor for these kinds of beliefs. So, if someone is covered with lesions and sores from birth, well, that's a difference. Are they likely to be seen as, having great supernatural power? Probably not, because the evolved disease avoidance psychology is going to say, stay away from that individual, right? So difference and supernatural power are going to intersect in ways that resonate with that being a good kind of a difference, like the ability to not eat something that people really like, or to not do something like sex that people really find enjoyable, is going to be an indication of power through difference, whereas the ability to sleep all day long when everyone else is working really hard is not, right? Okay. So you could presumably come up with a much more detailed list as a next step in the project about the commonalities, and then you could, post hoc examine that list and say, okay, what are the features here, right? So meat is likely to be tabooed, self-deprivation is powerful, whereas self-indulgence is not, right? Signs of imperviousness are compelling versus signs of vulnerability, and so on, right? So I like the general agenda, but I think you can go a lot farther than you have in integrating it from the psychological perspective.
Wait, so I just want to make sure I get what you're saying. So are you saying that there are likely to be patterns that run much deeper and which tell us more about how these kind of the mechanics of these cultural practices? I'm just also wondering what you meant by super releasers.
So a stimulus that provides a stronger response than the wild type stimulus, okay? And cultural evolution can construct those, and that's the bottom-up perspective on a super attractor, is that cultural evolution constructs super attractors by cobbling together features that overlap in their resonance with people's intuitions, right? So self-deprivation versus self-indulgence, right? Signs of health versus signs of weakness and vulnerability, meat versus vegetable matter. Those are just a whole bunch of, they're independent things that are there in the mind for totally different reasons, okay? But you would expect that over time, the marketplace of ideas, what will bubble to the top as successful is one that is checking many, 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 many boxes. And in any one culture, exactly which boxes are checked may vary from, its comparison culture. But it's not going to be the case that the really successful ideas across many cultures are simply checking a few of the possible boxes. They're going to be checking many of the possible boxes.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I haven't thought about it in that way, but that's an interesting way to think about it.
Great. Okay, so we have two more people in the queue. We have is that Maddie? And then Brian.
Hi. So first off, thank you for a very stimulating talk. I am specifically interested in the evil eye belief, which you mentioned briefly before, and I just skimmed your paper to be completely honest. But I was wondering if you've seen Bastian et al. 2019, and they're basically looking at differences in pathogen burden and the evil eye belief. So yeah, this is my first question. I didn't see it cited there, so I was just curious. It's a jump off point.
Yeah, I am familiar with that paper.
Okay.
That paper was accepted. I know it came out this weekend, but it was accepted 2 years ago.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It's quite a long process.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's a good point.
Yeah. I was also curious about, to be honest, I don't know how to pronounce their names, but Reiska Tran et al. It's a 2015. It's about belief in zero-sum games. Have you encountered that one? it's basically like it's a quantitative measure of the belief in limited good that seems to be characteristic of the evil eye belief. And I basically, in my master's thesis, I didn't find a relationship, at least the one I thought I was going to find, between that belief in zero-sum games and the evil eye belief. So I guess I also didn't find, for instance, in my my study, that the evil eye belief was associated with perceptions of inequality in the local area. So I guess I just be curious to hear what you think about that, given what's in this this paper, the current anthropology paper. And yeah, sorry, like I said, I just skimmed it, so you might have the answer in there. I don't know.
Well, yeah. So the paper doesn't talk about so the paper is essentially like coding the human
relations. Yeah, the standard cross-cultural
files.
sample. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Or and then looking for patterns in the structures of belief. So there aren't any conclusions about the social. There are like kind of, so there's two parts. There's the first part that identifying these features, and over there I didn't look for relationships between things like social context and the form of the beliefs. It was mostly just like what do these beliefs look like across societies. Your second, I mean, it's an interesting point. Yeah, I would be interested to look at your master's thesis. A point that I do make in the paper, which we can talk about later, is that, and I quickly mentioned this at the end, the argument is that there is a set of psychological mechanisms that are essentially like adaptive paranoia. So if I feel I cannot explain an event and I have felt kind of bullied or persecuted, there's just like quite a bit of literature on like what are the social conditions that trigger or predispose individuals to attribute misfortune to fellow group members. So the argument is just that those are the social conditions that would make these beliefs more likely. But I would be interested to see your master's thesis if you want to send it over, and then we can talk about this in greater depth.
Yeah, I'd love to chat about it, because I guess the Gershman finding that's, and I guess what you're talking about, it's explaining variance between groups, and be interesting to see if the same variables are also predictive within groups, or at least ones that are analogous. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, let's take a question from Brian Wood. Ryan. Ryan?
Looks like he's having internet connectivity problems, possibly.
Pass on me.
Maybe, sorry, I just muted myself. Maybe Brian can work on his connection. Let me jump in and ask a question, if I may, Manvir. I really like the idea of subjective cultural selection. I mean, it seems like just intuitively that happens all the time. And it's probably something, special for humans, because our subjectivity clearly influences social life in ways that probably other species don't. But I was curious to hear more thoughts from you about how we can sort of turn that into an actionable idea in cultural evolutionary theory, because it seems like the subjective objective distinction, I mean, we can make probably a clear cut there in some way, but also once you have social dynamics in an evolutionary system, it seems like it's going to be a little bit hard to tease apart the subjective and objective cultural selection components of selection. So I was just wondering to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, okay, I guess there are two quick thoughts. The first is, I presented that quite cursorily. The way that I really think about that is using a lot of the theoretical legwork that has been developed for hierarchical reinforcement learning or stuff like that. So, this is a whole literature about where does human motivation come from. We have and I think it's very consistent with the evolutionary literature, but we have superordinate currencies that we want to maximize: food, sex, prestige, etc. And then through various learning processes, we develop these sub-goal routines. So like, you know, I want to send an email, that's a sub-goal routine, but that's ultimately within a hierarchy that leads to these larger currencies. And I build these routines from various kind of learning processes. So one is model-based learning. So I simulate a model, like, oh, I ultimately want to get this job. And then I like break it down into subparts and enact those. And then I'm also updating on the basis of payoffs. So I engage in a behavior. I have cognitive mechanisms that are involved in the measure of payoff, you know, cost and expected outcome. So I only mention all of that to say, like, that is where I find a lot of the useful theoretical legwork to kind of be. And because there's also been a lot of work in that literature on like, how does someone evaluate whether an action is useful or whether an action is good? And that's what I've really thought about in relation to magic. So like, you know, if I have an action and all I'm really storing is the cost of this action, the total benefit and the probability of benefit, like can a mechanism purely like that, with maybe some other psychological mechanisms involved in evaluating causality, just explain the design of magic and just explain the evolution of magic. So Max Derricks, who's here, we are trying to run a laboratory experiment just to see, can we grow rituals or magic in the laboratory where they are not effective, but purely on the basis of like what we think about the parameters of human psychology. So if an outcome has a certain payoff structure, and people are choosing on the basis of their past experience, I'm kind of like, I don't know the extent to which I'm going to go into it, but the idea is essentially, can we develop complex culture purely on the basis of subjective evaluation, even when there is no objective payoff? And so to answer your question, I think in moving forward, the things I think are like building up a theoretical framework that I found useful from hierarchical reinforcement learning, potentially trying to test the extent to which things can evolve purely on the basis of subjective appeal, and like even when they don't have objective appeal or on the basis of what we know about psychology, can we predict it? And then maybe like using it, what I've been using is like using this as a general framework for explaining cultural products that then make predictions about how those cultural products should vary with contexts. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. No, those sound like really that sounds like an interesting empirical approach. I mean, I was also wondering, because, you know, obviously these words are really loaded, subjective and objective, and the way that you're describing it, the way you're describing it makes sense for a particular construal of what subjective means. I guess I wonder whether you could also distinguish something like, I mean, intersubjective, right? So,
wait, can you elaborate?
Well, I guess what I thought was interesting about the concept, one of the things I thought was interesting about the concept is, you know, the idea that's very popular of sort of social construction of reality, right? Where you can have things that are intersubjectively true, and therefore subjectively true, that take on some sort of an objective reality.
Yeah,
right. So I mean, classic examples would be like who we agree is the president of the United States is a matter of social consensus, but actually ends up having, you know, objective reality. And that it seems to me like that teasing apart some of those constructs in cultural evolution could be really useful.
Yeah, that's interesting. That I haven't really thought about that. When I've used subjective, it's mostly just like people are evaluating if something works on the basis of their psychological evaluation, or, you know, them evaluating it. The idea of like trying to integrate things like what you just described is interesting. But one thing I think is really important in how people evaluate whether something is good or works is like their cultural model that is built from social interaction. So Like if someone, and this is essentially a big difference, I think there are many differences between shamans and money managers, but one is like the model that you're working with. Are you working with a model where these important outcomes are overseen by agents, spirits, etc., or where they are the result of some kind of mathematical chaotic process? And depending on that model, that in turn determines like what is a compelling specialist. So just to mean that like my evaluation of whether something works is like really in very big ways influenced by my model. And that again, I think also, I don't want to force it to like work with hierarchical reinforcement learning, but you know, half of hierarchical reinforcement learning is like, how do we simulate actions within models that we have culturally inherited or that we have built on our own? I think it's I essentially had some people like explain the literature to me and was like, this seems very useful as a way of thinking about cultural evolution.
Definitely, definitely. I wanted to invite, so Brian, I chatted with Brian in the chat. If you can hear me, if you can somehow send your question via text, I can read it. I can read it out if your connection is bad. We have a few more minutes left, and Dan has his hand raised again, so maybe let's hear from Dan.
So I'm all in favor of a cultural models approach also, but if you think about it, that doesn't predict convergent cultural evolution. If anything, it produces divergence, because just path dependence about, there are going to be different cultural models across different ecosystems, different subsistent practices, different scales of society. That's going to introduce a bunch of different things about how the world is organized, right? So let the system run from there. If just the cultural models are the only important attractor in cultural evolution, then you'll get speciation over time and you won't get commonality. So when you find commonality, cultural models can't be the first go-to explanation, right? Unless you dissect them to a very, very elementary level that's beyond the level of what cognitive anthropologists typically mean by a cultural model. So there must be something else that is leading to that convergence. And that can be just functionalism, in terms of, well, this is a good way of solving problems in the world, or it can be the psychology of the individual minds that makes some ideas better to think than other ideas.
Yeah. So I would think that if we take the example of shamanism, a persistent cultural model or a consistent cultural model is that health, weather, etc., are overseen by these agents. Now, I think the fact that this model reliably develops is a product of psychology. So yeah, I would agree that, especially when we see patterns and those patterns seem to be explained by cultural models, I think a useful next step is to then say, well, to what extent are people's models themselves being shaped by this common psychological substrate?
Okay, our last question, if you don't mind, so we have a couple minutes left. And Brian, thank you, Brian. I'm just going to read this because it seems like your connection is slow. So Brian Wood writes, you showed that the behavioral arena, that the ceremonies you described, the norm violations that were being supernaturally punished, focused on meat sharing, and this caught my attention. You described this as a limited moral domain and limited in its scope, but I thought I might just flip the perspective a bit and mention the notion that the meat sharing context has been thought by some as a primary arena for the evolution of a generalizable moral system, including those approaches of people like Matteo Mameli, who claim that meat made us moral. I'm generally sympathetic with such an outlook and think that contrasts in how humans and other species share meat is and should be a serious topic for research, and I wonder if you have any work planned focusing on the origins of meat sharing norms or their consequences, given your fantastic data capturing the broader social context and belief systems at work. That's Brian's question.
Yeah, that was a great question. Yeah, I think when I've often thought about it, I've thought like meat sharing is very important in Mentawai, and it's striking that Sika Meinen oversees it, but I've kind of thought about it as one as one of other potential moral domains that it might oversee, others being like stealing or lying. But it is actually useful and interesting to think about this as this is like a fundamental and very important basis of sociality. Yeah, I guess that is an interesting perspective that I should reflect on more. In terms of future data collection, so I've like mostly at these ceremonies I note who shares meat. I haven't had so much behavioral data and behavioral data planned for meat sharing. What I was telling Clark before though is that I have one of my major data collection projects in Mentawai is just about social transgression of all forms. So Mentawai has this fining system. Someone like has a social transgression, then they have to pay pigs, cooking pots, sago trees, whatever. And so I have kind of been collecting all of these. Those very often just focus less on meat sharing transgressions and more on damaging others' property or eating it, which is actually also quite interesting. It's interesting that meat sharing seems to be a context where it's less enforceable by this legal system. To answer your question, yeah, those are interesting points. I haven't really thought about collecting more on meat sharing, but I think there are very interesting things going on with meat sharing, morality, and law that I have yet to really think through.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I see a sort of family resemblance convergence between Dan's question and Brian's, and you know, this and the idea of a super attractor, that you know, there's something particularly special about about meat in the context of a hunting society that tends to focus institutions and norms and beliefs around that, as opposed to many other things. And you know, that makes sense as part of this idea that there's something about the psychology of that domain that attracts certain kinds of beliefs or configurations. I want to, so I think we've reached the end of our time. I'd like to thank you so much again, Manvir, for coming and giving this great talk. If everybody would like to join me in welcoming and thanking Manvir. And I'm going to stop the recording right now. And one thing I'd like to say before we leave is I know that there's at least 1 or 2 students who are in the incoming UCLA cohort. If you'd like to stay on for a few more minutes and chat, please do. Manvir, I don't know if you have to go now, but if so, thank you for the visit. If you want to stay for a couple more minutes, please do. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a